But yeah, so now we're recording. Okay, so our meeting right now is being recorded. You can stop it, pause it. Let's see, here we go. Yes, okay. So I'm recording this now, just want everyone to know that. And then we're going to post it on our website later. And if you missed any of the sessions or you want to go back and revisit something that Bruce said, you can do that. The previous two are already on our website. So let's open with some prayer. Dear Father, thank you for bringing us together today to learn more about this very important issue in our society. And thank you for the gifts of Bruce Douglas and his talents and the lessons that he can teach us. We ask that you give us open hearts and minds as we seek greater understanding and unity in our church, in our nation, and our world. Amen. All right, Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I want to respond to one of the issues that has arisen in the chat, a very important issue, before I go to the substance of what I have to say today. It's such an important issue that I was tempted in thinking about this presentation today to junk what I had planned to do and just to talk about this issue. I've resisted the temptation to do that, however, but I want to just underscore my belief that this issue that I'm about to deal with in 3 or 4 sentences is worth at least a whole session, maybe a whole module on this topic. And the questioner, I don't know who it was, but there are a lot of smart people at Potomac, so I won't try to figure out who was the author of this question. But the question was roughly this: I'm paraphrasing. These things happened in the past. I don't feel any personal responsibility for these wrongs that were done to Blacks. So why should I feel any urgency about getting involved today? That's just a very, very important question. And it's a very common response for people in a setting like this, where there's most everybody is Caucasian. Now, my response to that is just the following. The reason that's a very important and complicated question has to do with, and the lawyers in the room will certainly appreciate this, the whole idea of collective responsibility. Can there be such a thing as collective responsibility as opposed to individual responsibility? That's where it gets complicated, and I could talk about that for, as I say, a long, long time. I'm going to resist the temptation to do so for the following reason. I think for Christians, in contrast to everybody else, for Christians, that concern is to some extent set aside, or at least it's marginalized by the following consideration. That's not Christian ethics. That's not Christian ethics. Let me say it again. Why do I say that? Well, because just think about the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan does not ask the question, was I responsible for the mugging of this person that I encounter on the side of the road? There's a wrong that has been done, and the clear imperative coming out of that story is take responsibility for it, whether you did it or not, whether you were the perpetrator or not. And keep in mind that story, which is one of the most important stories in the whole Bible, one of the most important themes in the whole Bible, comes as Jesus is answering the question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And then he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And I've been in more than one ethics class where the instructor begins by saying, if you want to understand the foundation of Christian ethics, think about that particular story. Now, as I say, I'm so tempted, but I'm not going to do anything more with that except to point that out and to put that in your thought and maybe your discussion as a seed, which warrants discussion later at Potomac. Today, my theme is desegregation. Desegregation. And I'm actually only going to tell part of the story of desegregation in American life and in turn in the history of American Presbyterianism. because in a sense, it's the era through which we're still living. I'm going to focus on the beginning of that era, which is the 1950s and 60s. I want to stress that. I haven't got time here to do anything more than the 1950s and 60s, but there's a whole story which evolves in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and on into the present moment. And maybe at another time I can come back and talk about that. But it's enough to talk about the 50s and 60s because they're such a momentous period. I'm therefore identifying the 50s and 60s for you as the beginning of a process which has been unfolding ever since. Let me say that again. The beginning of a process that has been unfolding ever since. Needless to say, not in a simple, uncomplicated way. It's been a terribly complicated process, but I want to try to make sense of the beginning of that process in the 1950s and 60s. And above all, to talk about, of course, the role of Christians and even more specifically, the role of Presbyterians. The meaning of the term desegregation. Let me offer this summary statement about that. The term desegregation is an appropriate term to characterize what happened in the 1950s and 60s, even though the actual progress just began there, was very slow. There was a crucial development in that period, which sets everything that occurs from the 60s on in a different place from what I described last week. And that is, in the 1950s and even more the 1960s, segregation policies were delegitimized. Let me say that again. Segregation policies, which up to that point had been taken for granted, had been even woven into the law, enforced by the federal government. In the period of the 60s and after, segregation policies lost their legitimacy. And they lost their legitimacy not just in law, but they lost their legitimacy in the eyes of much, not all, of the American people. In the late 1940s, as I said in my last presentation, there were sort of inklings of a movement away from segregation. One of those inklings was the fact that the mainline Protestant churches in the main went on record as opposing segregation. The Northern Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, for example, adopted in the late 1940s a series of resolutions year after year after year in their general assemblies in the late 1940s, which said the following, and this became a kind of mantra: our goal as a church is to have an unsegregated church in an unsegregated society. An unsegregated church in an unsegregated society. Now keep in mind, at the same time, most of the people who went to church who were Presbyterians were in highly segregated churches. But nonetheless, the aspiration was, the goal, an unsegregated church in an unsegregated society. And there were other things, you know, the famous Marian Anderson incident or Jackie Robinson in the early 1940s. All of us have got in our minds sort of iconic events that begin to crack the race line, the race barrier. But in the main, in most institutions in American society, there was rampant segregation, which was accepted as legitimacy. In labor unions, in colleges, in schools, as well as in churches, there was segregation taken for granted as just the way things are. And by the way, there's a lot of evidence. Public opinion data, by the way, doesn't go terribly far back into the first part of the 20th century, viable, good public opinion data. But we do have some data which suggests that in the United States, in the period before the Second World War especially, there was kind of sort of taken for granted acceptance of the need for, quote unquote, racial segregation. But then a couple of things happen. And this is, you might say, the cracking of the ice, the cracking of the glacier, segregation being taken for granted. And then things happen which begin to call it into question in a dramatic way. The first of those things, and it's no accident that these things come after the end of the Second World War. Now, that's the kind of line which, if this were a course for 13 weeks, as I typically taught when I was an employed academic, you would spend a whole class on that. why was it at the end of the Second World War? I'm not going to go into that here, but that's a kind of topic for further reading on the part of those of you who are interested in this particular question. Why after the Second World War? There are all kinds of theories about that. But one of the things that happens, which is crucially important, and I know there's some people on this call who have a military background, so they will appreciate the significance of this, although all of us should. Truman desegregates by executive order the military. Let me say that again. Truman in 1948 desegregates the military by executive order. Now, he'd wanted to do it. He'd wanted the Congress to do it. He'd wanted Congress to take action on that. But keep in mind, and some of us can literally remember, I'm dating myself here, I can remember the faces of these people. There was a block of very powerful senators, partly because of the rule of seniority in the Congress, some very powerful senators from the South, people like John Stennis, Richard Russell from the South, who were a kind of bloc opposing any sort of movement on this. So they actively opposed any action by the Congress. Truman finally just got fed up and said, I'm going to do this. And he did it by fiat. And that began a powerful change in American society, which actually extended beyond the borders of the continental United States. I was giving this talk in another church, and a woman wrote me a long email after the talk, in which she said, I can remember as a girl going to military schools on the base. My father was in the military in Europe when that happened. And what a dramatic thing it was for my experience as a girl in the schools. So, and another person has pointed out to me, this desegregation of the military had the effect of reaching down into the lives of so many people all over the United States, were affected gradually, not initially, by this fundamental change. And I have to say, this is not a political speech, but I have to say, this comes from the federal government by fiat. Take note, it comes from the federal government by fiat. It wasn't something that was neatly evolved through the development of the society. On the contrary, I would say, I'm going to be editorial here, a brave president takes this action, which begins a series of changes that ripple out in American society. And then an equally brave decision, I'm being nakedly partisan here, an equally brave decision is the famous Brown decision of the Supreme Court in 1954, an epical moment in American history, an epical moment, because that decision, the Brown decision in 1954, handed down by the Warren Court, did what? It delegitimized separate but equal. Let me say that again. It delegitimized separate but equal. It said that separate doesn't, that separate is not equal. And it said, in effect, that the segregated schools, which existed all over the United States, not just in the South, these segregated schools, these racially segregated schools, were a violation of the US Constitution. They were a violation of the Equal Protection Law, stipulation of the 14th Amendment, and they had to stop. There was a clear mandate coming from the court saying, this has got to stop. This has got to begin. And of course, that is a bombshell. That drops a bombshell into the middle of American society, especially in the South, but not just the South. I want to stress, especially in the South, but not just the South. And over time, it becomes evident that the resistance to this, think of Boston, think of Chicago, think of Detroit, the resistance to this is in its own way every bit as pronounced outside the South as it is in the South. But initially, when this bombshell was dropped, predictably, the opposition was fierce, and it came initially from the South. Now, I live in the state of Virginia, and I can tell you that Virginia has what I would characterize as a sordid history on this topic. And by the way, one of the fascinating things in Virginia politics right now is the way in which people are sort of struggling with that legacy and trying to come to terms with that legacy. Because there was something in Virginia, and Virginia to some extent took the lead in this regard. There was something in Virginia called massive resistance to the demand of the courts that the students be unsegregated or desegregated. And on the whole, that became the model for the South. One place after another, when it was discovered, I'll get to the sort of issue that this the implication of this for the churches in a moment. When it was discovered that there was going to be serious enforcement of this demand, there was going to be serious enforcement of this demand that the schools be these. I thought somebody's got, let's see here. But when there was going to be serious enforcement of that, there was an emergence, unfortunately, heavily supported by the churches to create schools that were in effect segregation academies. And that became a very common practice in the South. Now, because of the active resistance to this, the active resistance mobilized by public officials, people who had taken an oath to protect the Constitution and all the rest, as that began to develop, it became evident that if the federal government did not take steps to enforce it, it would just die. It would become a kind of stipulation on the books, which had no practical effect. And that became more and more, if you look carefully at the history of this period, that became more and more the common opinion about it among informed people. And there was a sense that the court had decreed, but what good is a court decree if the other parts of government are not willing to enforce it? And for that reason, I think it's appropriate to say that there would have been probably a gradual retreat from the Brown decision. There would have been a retreat from that decision, and it might have, you could well say, just died, fizzled out as a development, except for something which happened in the mid-1950s. And this is a kind of remarkable thing, given the history that I have laid out for you in my previous talks. In the mid-1950s, there emerges a movement led by Black clergy in the South, supported primarily by very poor, impoverished Black parishioners of their churches, to resist the weakness of the government in dealing with this. And by the way, let me say the weakness of the government applies. I'm going to be even-handed in my critique here. When there was violence in the South in resisting the desegregation policies, especially at the highest level, the level of higher education, but not just higher education, Eisenhower, who was a nominal Presbyterian, resisted strongly the idea of using force, especially using troops to enforce the demand for desegregation of schools. He was very reluctant to do it, but finally did it in 1957. He was worried about this political opposition in the South, and he kept dragging his feet and so forth, but eventually took action in 1957, drawing the federal government into it. Later, when John Kennedy comes in, Kennedy, who sometimes people think of as a great champion of civil rights, was very reluctant, again, to get involved in using federal troops to enforce the action to bring about desegregation of schools in the South. Eventually, primarily through the intervention of his brother, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy began to take a different stance on that. But at the beginning, because of the power of these Southern senators, he was very, very reluctant to act on that. Now, back to the mid-1950s. My guess is everybody on this call has heard the name Rosa Parks. I wouldn't say that in every setting, so I'm complimenting you. But I think probably everybody on this call, it's partly because, let me just be clear, it's partly because everybody on this call tends to be of a certain age, shall we say. But we all know Rosa Parks. If I were teaching at Georgetown and this were a class of 18-year-olds, that would be ancient history, I assure you. Rosa who? But we all know Rosa Parks. And we all know Rosa Parks as the little lady. I'm tempted to be very condescending here. Really was, she's an extraordinarily important figure. At the urging of the NAACP, this was clearly a setup. This was not something that just happened accidentally. A domestic, as they said in those days, a woman who worked as a domestic, was at one point in Montgomery, Alabama, refusing to go to the back of the bus Now I'm tempted to break into song here, except you don't want me to do that. But I say that because that was one of the great hymns of the civil rights movement. I don't want to go to the back of the bus, to the back of the bus, to the back of the bus. And of course, that is a symbol. It's a dramatic symbol of segregation, because the idea was that Rosa Parks, as a Black woman, should not be sitting in the front part of the bus. She should be sitting in the back, if indeed she should be sitting at all. And as scripted by the NAACP, she refused to go to the back of the bus. Promptly got her arrested, and that begins the Montgomery Bus Boycott, where the Black community in Montgomery, and they've been preparing for this, the Black community is using economic power, a bus boycott, to begin to put pressure on one very simple thing, and that is segregation in public accommodations. Now, in that moment, which was, as I said, orchestrated by the NAACP, and by the way, she then went to jail, and then there were marches and more marches, and people were going to jail, and Montgomery suddenly becomes a kind of theater of nonviolent resistance to, and by the way, with a lot of very, very vicious response on the part of the civil authorities to the demonstrations and so forth. In the middle of that development, there is sort of a coming together of the Black church leaders, not all of whom were sympathetic to this, by the way. There were many Black church leaders who said, this is really dangerous stuff. Let me just keep preaching the gospel. I don't want to talk about that stuff. But there were some Black church leaders in Montgomery, Alabama, one of whom was a young guy who was 2 years out of graduate school named Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old. He was 26 years old at the time, and he was identified early on as a good spokesperson for this movement. Now, that turned out to be an inspired choice, because not only had Martin Luther King Jr., his father was a famous clergyman, not only had he a good voice, but he also had thought a lot about the strategic issues involved, and was, the moment that he began to sort of assume this public role, Martin Luther King Jr. was a principled proponent of Gandhian Hindu, Gandhian nonviolence. That had been a theme, by the way, in earlier Black thinking. How do we cope with this monster, which is American racism? And one thought was, well, we'll try to deal with it much the way Gandhi had dealt with the struggle against British colonialism in India. Nonviolent struggle, principled nonviolence. So King becomes a proponent of that and rises to prominence very quickly in the South. And what happens, and this kind of just stuff beginning to happen dramatically, somehow that caught on, not only in Montgomery, but other places. And people began to say, yes, brother, that's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we want. And it also caught on very quickly among college students. And you began to have another kind of direct action, as it was called then, direct action in places like Lynchburg, Virginia, where a bunch of college students sat in at a lunch counter and got, just to give you an example, the people who sat in at that lunch counter were from Randolph-Macon Women's College. And for the one act of sitting in and getting arrested, the president's student body was thrown out of school. And why would that be such a strong response? Because they sensed that something really challenging was in the making here. Another one took place at Greensboro, North Carolina. College students, integrated groups coming together at the lunch counter again, getting arrested, and violence sort of circling around, etc. And so what begins to emerge in the late 1950s, it sort of has a domino effect. You begin challenging lunch counters. You begin challenging in a famous and kind of sort of striking for our purposes theme, kneel-ins, where segregated churches are challenged. Blacks show up at the door of the church and insist upon being seated in public worship. And believe it or not, they are denied access to public worship. Indeed, the church calls the cops. Imagine being an usher on that day. They call the cops in order to keep these people out of the white church, if you can just believe it. So you have kneel-ins and sit-ins and boycotts and a whole kind of ripple effect. And the amazing thing about it, from the point of view of journalists who looked at it, is King in particular was getting, King and his forces, they formed something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which became a kind of organized force in the South. They were getting, amazingly, the support of poor Blacks who were field hands in the main, who were willing to risk a lot of things, including their jobs, in order to support these actions as they began to develop. And by the way, by the early 1960s, they really were going for broke when they descended into the Deep South, Mississippi and Alabama with voter registration campaigns. One of the famous heroines of that was a woman, was a field hand, literally, called Hammer, Ellie Hammer, who just insisted on organizing her own friends for a voter registration campaign that led to enormous violence. Now, in the middle of all that, I'm winding up here to throw a punch, and here it comes. In the middle of all that, as things are developing, and they're using, by the way, they're using something which is a very important resource in that period, and that is television. A lot of what's going on is the critics said they're staging these events. Well, absolutely right, they were staging these events. Why? They were staging these events in order to appeal to the wider nation, to get press, and they got press. But they were doing something else as well, and King was very calculated about this. King said, this cannot succeed unless we appeal to the conscience of the nation. This cannot succeed unless we appeal to the conscience of the nation. He said, not even the bravest politician is going to take the actions which are necessary unless the wider nation is supported. And then he said, and this is widely, if you read the biographies of King, it's very clear in there that this is exactly the calculus. He said, and the best way to appeal to the conscience of the nation is to appeal to the white churches. The best way to appeal to the conscience of the nation is to appeal to the white churches. And he meant primarily the white Protestant churches, and he meant what today we would characterize as the mainline white Protestant churches. And he did. He appealed very directly to them. And he knew some of these people. Keep in mind, in my last presentation, I talked about the beginning of conversation, Black-white conversation in the ecumenical movement, the Federal Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches. Black leaders had participated in those conversations. So they knew these people to some extent. And they appealed to them very directly. And the astonishing thing, and I say truly astonishing given the history, is that those churches on the whole responded with vigor affirmatively. Let me say that again. Those churches responded to this appeal on the whole vigorously, affirmatively. It meant they said, yes, we need to meet this challenge. There were 4 or 5 churches in particular that played that role, white churches, and I want to name them. There were the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Methodists, and the Baptists, the Northern Baptists, not the Southern Baptists. Those 5. There were others who were involved, but not nearly so much. Those 5 were sort of the spear carriers in this struggle, and they were very influential in the life of the National Council of Churches. What do I mean when I say they responded affirmatively? Well, what I don't mean is they passed another resolution. As a matter of fact, as things unfolded, King sarcastically said at one point, well, at least they didn't pass another resolution. Which of course they'd been doing for years with very little effect on anything aspirational. Instead, they did the following. They mobilized resources and strategically invested those resources in the struggle. Let me say that again. They mobilized resources and invested those resources very strategically in the struggle. What do I mean by that? Well, in all of those denominations, they created something, a new thing, just on the, you might say on the fly they created. And anybody who's dealt with a bureaucracy knows creating something on the fly is an achievement. They created in every one of these churches something called the Commission on Race and Religion. And the Commission on Race and Religion was not a study group. I mean, it had study components, but in each case, it was primarily an action group. They would get money and use that money to invest in tactical support of the civil rights struggle. Tactical support of the civil rights struggle. Now, part of that meant the following. literally giving money to Martin Luther King and his people. So they provided financial support. But another thing they did was to mobilize people in their denominations, primarily clergy for maybe obvious reasons, to go to the places where bodies were needed, especially, for example, the civil rights, the voting rights campaigns in the Deep South. They mobilized clergy, sent them there in order to participate, you might say, with boots on the ground. I'm told, I've never been able to pin this down precisely, but I did have conversation with one of the people who was actively involved in this, who said that in the Presbyterian case, in the early 1960s, when the appeal went out for people from outside the South going to the South to invest some time there, over 400 Presbyterian clergy in the course of the early 2 or 3 years of the 1960s went at one point or another for a sustained period of time, by which I mean several weeks, to participate in one or another civil rights activity. Some of those people lost their jobs. Let me say that again. Some of those people lost their jobs. Imagine yourself sitting in a session meeting and your pastor comes to you and says, I want to go to Mississippi to be part of this struggle for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. Do I have your approval? And occasionally what would happen is, and you can imagine the debates that would break out. You know yourselves better than I do, who would say what. But occasionally they would be denied approval and they would go anyway. And when they went anyway and were denied approval, typically they came home without a job. 2 or 3 of those people lost their lives in Mississippi. They lost their lives through the violence that was inflicted upon civil rights activists. So that was a second. And by the way, symbolically, that was hugely important. Hundreds of people, clergy tended to be, but not always, younger clergy, coming back. You can imagine the stories they had to tell when they came back to Potomac or the church I worship in or whatever, telling about what they had experienced. And then the final thing, which was no less important, was the following. Once it became evident that this struggle was going to, you might say, come to culmination in a battle for legislation. And I'm talking about, of course, the Great Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This, by the way, these pieces of legislation I'm talking about, this is the moment when official delegitimation of segregation happens. When you begin passing these pieces of legislation, you're on your way to a different attitude towards segregation throughout the nation. In the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is kind of the most prominent of all of these pieces of legislation, which developed over a period of about 5 years, culminating in an Open Housing Act toward the end of the 1960s. There was a titanic struggle on the floor of Congress, on the floor of the Senate, with filibuster and all the rest. And I won't go through that history, although it's fascinating. But what the Commission on Religion and Race in the Presbyterian case did was the following. It appealed to the clergy throughout and the sessions throughout the denomination to try to get the support of local churches, people writing to their congresspeople and so forth, writing to their senators to support the legislation which was on the floor of the Senate. And of course, it passed. It passed. And after the fact, as I told you last time, I mentioned this when I was commenting on what was to come, Hubert Humphrey, who was at that time, of course, a senator, eventually to become vice president, but at that time he was a senator and he was the manager of the legislation in the Senate, said after the fact, this legislation would not have passed had it not been for the churches. This legislation would not have passed, hugely important in American life, would not have been passed. And why? Well, there was in the period of from the late 1950s through the mid 1960s, I'm about to add another complicating part to this story, but in that period, there's clear evidence of a titanic change in American public opinion outside the South, but not just outside the South, with regard to the legitimacy of segregation. Let me say that again. In that period, segregation lost its legitimacy. People began talking about segregation as a bad thing, which the country needed to get beyond. People who never were involved in any of this, for example, who just sat in the pew on a Sunday morning. But the change that had come over the churches was clearly part of, and the television, what was appearing on television and all the rest, was an important part in changing the mood of the country with respect to the legitimacy of segregation. Two or three things I want to say about the impact of this on the life of the churches before turning to the sequel to it, which comes in the latter part of the 1960s. I want to mention three names for you as important figures to have in mind as you think about this period because of the leadership role they played. One of them is white, a man called Eugene Carson Blake. B-L-A-K-E, Eugene Carson Blake, who was the stated clerk of the PCUSA and then UPUSA General Assembly in this period. A pastor who his own personal history was that he'd been raised in St. Louis, went to Princeton Seminary, spent some time on the mission field, and then came back and pastored two churches, one in Upper New York State, and then later in Pasadena, California. That was a big church, and from that became this important figure in the Presbyterian world. He was by far the most important Presbyterian in deciding this was a cause that had to be supported unequivocally. By the way, eventually, one of the things that got him on the front page of the New York Times was getting arrested in Baltimore, trying to desegregate an amusement park in Baltimore, along with a famous Anglican named Bishop Pike. They were big buddies, and they were part of a sort of staged attempt to desegregate that kind of public accommodations. He became a very important figure, eventually became not only the president of the National Council of Churches, but the general secretary of the World Council of Churches, largely because of his role in the struggle against racism in the United States. A very, very important figure. But I want to name two blacks. I've been stressing all along in this series how oblivious, and I would say myself as well as many others, how oblivious white Presbyterians have been to blacks. You know, they've been there, largely ignored, largely marginalized in terms of their thinking. Well, this begins to change in the 1960s, and that's one of the things I want to emphasize. There begins to be a change internally in American Presbyterianism in this period because blacks begin to be taken seriously as voices that have to be contended with. Very important change. That was not true in the early 1950s. By the latter part of the 1960s, you begin to get black leadership in the mainline church, all the mainline churches, black leadership. And by the way, that's still the case to this day. It's a very important change, very important development. Two of the pioneers of that were, first of all, a man called Edler Hawkins, E-D-L-E-R, Edler Hawkins, who was the first black moderator of the General Assembly in 1963. That was a kind of epical moment when the General Assembly has its first black moderator. Not the moderator of a black synod, no, the moderator of the whole church. And he was a really very remarkable figure. Went to what was sent by the Presbytery of New York to create a church. I think that's the hardest kind of pastoring, to create a church out of nothing. He created a church in the Bronx, St. Augustine Presbyterian Church, which went from 3 members to over 1,000. At the time of his leaving that church, it had over 1,000 members, mainly black, not entirely, but mainly black. He becomes the first moderator of the General Assembly and a very important figure in shaping shall we say, the policies of the church with regard to race. And then a favorite of mine, Gay Road Wilmore, who, if any of you attended the recent convocation of the Reformed Institute, there was a whole segment on Gay Wilmore. Gay Wilmore was an academic who taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, a Christian ethicist, who became the main staff person in the Commission on Religion and Race, wrote a whole series of very, very good books. I commend them to you. Whole series of very good books on race and religion and American Presbyterianism and religion. I've relied upon some of his accounts in preparing these talks. He became, as I say, the main staff person for the Commission on Religion and Race and a confidant of Martin Luther King Jr. He was the main Presbyterian that King would talk to in strategizing and thinking about the challenges that the movement faced. The 1960s are a turning point in American history in so many ways, but certainly on the issue of race, for the reasons I've indicated. And let me say, one that I need now to dot is up to the 1960s, on the whole, not just in the churches, but in the wider society, the fact that the Blacks had articulate spokesmen didn't matter a whit in terms of the shaping of public life and public policy. It did not matter at all. You had really eloquent voices, people whose ideas to this day are impressive, were largely ignored. And then one of the things that happens in the 1960s is that changes, and it changes permanently. Just think about public life without an articulate Black voice today. Some people have said the turning point leading to Barack Obama is precisely this moment in the 1960s when Blacks finally are taken seriously as figures whose voices should count for something. And boy, they did. You see those pictures. Those pictures are wonderful from the 1960s, where King is literally standing face to face with John Kennedy, and they're exchanging views as equals in terms of public influence. Indeed, some would argue on race, King far exceeded John Kennedy in terms of influence, perhaps even Robert Kennedy. All right, that's the first part of the story. Now, I'm going to add, I could stop now, and this would be a story from my point of view with a happy ending. Unfortunately, that would be a false narrative. Here comes the second part of the story. Beginning around the mid-1960s, the mood in the country changes. Beginning around the mid-1960s, it's hard to date it exactly, but I'll give you some indicators which most everybody will recognize immediately. For one thing, what begins to happen starting about 1965 is that King, because of his prominence, because of his success, the success of his organization. By the way, the other important organization in the civil rights struggle, I've mentioned one, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The other is a student-led organization that was led initially by John Lewis, called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were, in some respects, more radical than King, but they collaborated all the way along. So SNCC and SCLC were the shock troops, the strategic driving force in the period that I've been talking about up to this point. But King, with the urging of people like the leaders of SNCC, saw that the issues that were confronted in the South were by no means the whole of the issue. It was great to be able to desegregate lunch counters, but desegregation of lunch counters hardly solved the problem of the disparity in life conditions between Blacks and whites in the whole United States of America. And so King begins to widen his agenda, starts moving outside the South, moves into a very difficult struggle in Chicago, another one in Detroit, and of course, you might say on the northern tier of the South, Memphis, where he loses his life. Now, in all of those struggles, what was emerging was that economics was every bit as important as these narrowly legal issues having to do with access to public accommodations. So the agenda is expanding, and as the agenda is expanding to take into account, you might say, the larger issues of poverty in American society and all that entails, he is also encountering a different kind of Black community. It's the Black Ghetto. The Black Ghetto is very different from the rural South. The Black Ghetto is a different world with, if you will, a different kind of Black religious experience. So that's one thing that's happening, as that begins to happen, the gospel of nonviolence, if I can put it that way, is challenged by other forms of Black thought. Particularly forms of Black thought which have a kind of militancy about them, which are to some extent even scornful of the gospel of nonviolence. Black power begins to emerge in the latter part of the 1960s, and Black power in the embodiment of people like Muhammad X, the Black Panthers, all of those, you might say, forces that are stirred to some extent by the success of the civil rights movement, but are primarily strong in places other than the Deep South, that begin to surface very quickly. Largely, if you look carefully at the actual historical records, largely because of incidents having to do with police violence, there developed a whole series of riots, dozens and dozens of riots centered on the Black community in one place after another. Los Angeles, Washington itself, of course, but also, you might say, cities of lesser size like Wilmington, Delaware, the background to some of Joe Biden's thinking about race. Another one that I know a lot about is Dayton, Ohio. There was in sort of mid-sized towns in America, there were suddenly these race riots that developing, which profoundly affected people's thinking about issues of race, and of course, presented in their own way a terrible challenge, a dramatic challenge to the leadership of the civil rights movement. And then, and by the way, definitely colored people, the white community's thinking about race. You can't just, even if you're observing from the suburbs, you can't help but be affected if you see night after night after night riots in one place after another. A season of riots, as one book on the subject characterizes this. And then, of course, there is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which is a dramatic event in the life of the Black community, not to speak of the wider nation, followed, because there was by that time a lot of affection for Robert Kennedy, followed by, not soon after, by the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And then, of course, I say the best to last, as this is happening, you have an emerging struggle in the wider nation, which is just tearing the nation apart, having to do with debate over the legitimacy of the Vietnam War. And the civil rights movement morphs into support for opposition to the Vietnam War. King himself becomes an outspoken, before his death, becomes an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War. Now, I hope all of that is sort of creating an image in your mind. I would try to summarize that image by saying storm clouds emerging over the situation that I described as being the one that pertained in the first part of the 1960s. All of this had an effect upon what was going on in the churches. And I want to talk here mainly about the white churches. The Black churches I'm going to have to save for another day, but the white churches were profoundly affected by this set of developments that I've just described. First, in the later part of the 1960s, in every single one of those denominations, every single one of those mainline Protestant denominations, white denominations, that contributed actively to the success of the civil rights movement, in every one of them, by the latter part of the 1960s, there emerges a Black caucus, Black Presbyterian caucus, Black Methodist caucus, Black Episcopal caucus, a coming together of Blacks to what? To do what? Well, to assert their interests over against, to some extent, whites in the rest of the church. It's a very important development. And by the way, the Black Presbyterian caucus to this day exists in our denomination, as does the Methodist version. It's very important. But before that time, by the way, before that time, there was no such thing. But now the emergence, you might say, precisely at the moment when Blacks are beginning to get a leadership position in the white denominations, there emerges this thing called Black caucuses. And second, as that happens, there begin to emerge what I would characterize as relatively radical forms of Black theology. Let me say that again, relatively radical forms of Black theology. Black liberation theology. Now, all along I've been stressing, there has been in the Black church a kind of prophetic tradition. You heard me characterize that. I'm not going to go through it again. It always entailed the following: an insistence that one of the main themes of the Bible is liberation. The God we worship is a God of liberation. The God we worship is the God of Exodus. And we need to be liberated from this oppression. They kept saying that over and over and over again, decade after decade after decade, as I said, largely ignored. Well, that really surfaces now dramatically in the latter part of the 1960s, accompanied by the other theme, which I linked to the Black prophetic tradition, which is justice. And justice has a very specific meaning here. And it's one which tends to make white people, myself included, uncomfortable. And that is, we have been wronged. We are deserving of some kind of compensation for the wrong that has been inflicted on us. And I'm getting to, of course, a topic which has been insofar as it's been a matter of public debate, always been aroused white opposition, and that is the idea of reparations. We are owed reparations for the years, the decades in which our labor, the fruits of our labor were taken from us. We were deprived of that. We are owed something. We are owed reparations. And by now it's much more than 40 acres and a mule. It's a lot more that we are owed. And so you get in the latter part of the 1960s, that kind of thinking articulated, you might say, very, very eloquently by people who are by that time teaching. The most famous one is a man called James Cone, who teach in mainline seminaries. He taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York, holding, ironically, the Reinhold Niebuhr Chair of Social Ethics. So he's holding the Niebuhr Chair of Social Ethics and arguing for the kinds of things I just indicated. Now, not only did that happen, but the most eloquent Black leaders in the mainline Protestant denominations were wholehearted in their support of this. Gay Wilmore, for example, in the Presbyterian case, wholehearted in his support of the idea of reparations. And there was in 1968 a convening of a whole series of Black leaders from all over the churches, Protestant churches. Roman Catholics played very little role in this, in something called the Black Economic Development Conference. If you're interested in this topic, go read about that. It's a fascinating little chapter in the history of this problem that I'm discussing in these talks. The Black Economic Development Conference brought together distinguished Black leaders. King, of course, by this point was deceased, but there were all kinds of important figures in the civil rights struggle. And they came together and at the end of it, issued a Black Manifesto. And the Black Manifesto was a demand for $500 million in reparations. $500 million in reparations to the Black community, which would be channeled into, through this organization, Black economic development, that is economic development in the Black community. A lot of the things they talked about in that, for example, are the kind of things that are now discussed under the rubric of the implications of various federal policies denying Blacks the opportunity to develop wealth on their own, which is a very interesting issue. Now, this cause was taken up in the late 1960s very vigorously by people like Gay Wilmore, and it led to serious conversations in the mainline white denominations about this. You know, your most articulate Blacks are pressing the case for this. You've got to talk about it. And there were a couple of meetings at the Presbyterian General Assembly where this was front and center and actively discussed. Now, the interesting thing is, without exception, the mainline white denominations at the end of the day, after back and forth, lots of conversations, said, well, we're not going to do this. At least we're not going to do this on the terms on which you have requested. They had their reasons for saying that. But they said, we're going to take action in our own way that contributes to the alleviation of the problems you've identified. If you look carefully at the life of the Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA today, you will see an echo of that decision in the program known as the Development of Peoples, where every year congregations throughout the Presbyterian Church are asked to contribute to a fund that will provide for, in effect, funding for economic development programs, not just in the Black community, but others. But on the whole, all the denominations said, we're not going to do this. And by the way, the appeal was not just to white Protestants, it was to Roman Catholics and Jews and a whole series of other religious communities as well. On the whole, I have to say, the ones who took it seriously at all were the white mainline Protestant churches. The Roman Catholics dismissed it out of hand. And interestingly enough, the Jewish community responded very negatively to this too, and very skeptically to it. The last thing I want to say, and by the way, once the debate about that emerged in the denomination, it was, as you can well imagine, profoundly divisive in the wider church. When you were in conversations about this in presbyteries and synods, and by the way, the way in which people discussed this was very different depending upon whether or not it was a presbytery in which there was a strong Black presence. In some presbyteries, there's hardly any Black presence. And needless to say, there's a different tone to those conversations. The final thing I want to mention, and I know I'm nearing here the hour when the minute, not just the hour, when I need to stop. But let me ask you for a show of hands. How many of you have heard of Angela Davis? Hands up. Wow. Literate people, or at least people with memories. The Presbyterian situation was complicated further in 1968 by the following. A grant of money by the Commission on Religion and Race to the Legal Defense Fund of somebody named Angela Davis. Now, who was Angela Davis? By the way, I was speaking about this in another church, and the pastor said, believe it or not, when I went to a church in Upper New York State 20 years ago, meaning about the turn of the century, he said, people in that church were still talking about Angela Davis. So here, who was Angela Davis? She was a philosophy professor, a young philosophy professor, Black woman at UCLA, and she was a Marxist. And she was, of course, Black and a very eloquent defender of the more radical ideas of the Black Panthers. Black Panthers, of course, were mainly a California movement, although they had to reach elsewhere. And they flirted with violence. They flirted with violence in the sense that they, much like, shall we say, another political group today, walked around with holsters on their guns on their hips all the time, and they were threatening to the white community. Well, one of their group had been charged with an offense, and in the legal proceedings in the courtroom, he somehow got a hold of a gun and shot up the place. And needless to say, there was an outcry, and he was getting ready to be put on trial when this legal defense fund was created. And a local Presbyterian church in Sacramento, California, asked the Commission on Religion and Race to support the legal defense fund of Angela Davis. And they did, to the tune of 10 grand. $10,000. Now, it wasn't a huge amount of money, but the symbolism of it was enormous. Presbyterian Church supports Marxist philosopher. That was the headline. Supports the cause of Marxist philosopher. A number of Presbyterian churches left the denomination, that is, congregations left the denomination over that alone, although clearly it was a symbolic event. Broadly, it created a rather, shall we say, deep division in the denomination between many whites and Blacks. And let me just conclude by telling you what the response of the Black leadership was. The Black leadership were appalled that the white leadership of the church was, shall we say, equivocal in their treatment of this action by the Commission on Religion and Race. And so the Black leadership of the church gathered together and asked for donations from their members to the tune of $500 a member. They raised the equivalent of 10 grand and gave the 10 grand back to the denomination, but they were embittered by it profoundly. They thought sort of as they began to really dig deeply into this struggle, the rug was pulled out from under them by the leadership of the church. The end result was that by the late 1960s, the mood, not just in the denomination, but in the wider country, had changed profoundly. And that, of course, is the sort of point of threshold into the 70s and beyond. That's got to be the subject for another talk. I can't possibly do justice to that in 2 sentences here. So let me stop with the ending of this story at the stage of Angela Davis.
As one who lived through some of that, I was raised and went to high school in Albany, New York. Albany then had 250,000 population. There were two big high schools. One was almost all white. I was a jock, played basketball. The only association I ever had with Black people were in competitive sports. Then I got drafted in 1950, and they drafted 25,000 men who were going to be rushed to Korea. We were in trouble. We used to sit around in the barracks with 65 men, and someone would say, "Does anybody know where Korea is?" But we learned to get to know each other. I got to know a young Black man, wonderful man. Turned out that I found out he had a glass eye. This was the kind of thing that happened when they were massed through the medical examination. He never should have been taken. We had 6 days, and we were going to be shipped out of Fort Devens in Massachusetts to a training base to get quick training and then off to Korea. And I told him, "You got to go on sick call. That you shouldn't be here. You." And he got, he wouldn't go. And I finally told him if he didn't go, I'd take him. And he did. And the happiest day that I had up to that point was when I saw him later that day with this marvelous smile on his face. And he said, "Bill, I'm going home." And I said, "That's exactly what we should have done." We don't have time for the rest of it. But we also went then later on. I was worked for a company that hired only college men and developed their management from that group. We had to visit every plant. And that was the first time I was ever south of Baltimore, Maryland. And as we walked through the plant, we saw signs on the wall on drinking fountains, white only. This is 1950, the things you're talking about. Stayed there for 2 years. Later on in Texas, we were coming back, and it was at the time when a lot of people from the North were in the South, in Mississippi and all of that area, helping Blacks get registered. And the Blacks ran into horrible resistance. And I remember a night when, this is before credit cards, couldn't make reservations, 2 cars with children and my mother. And we watched burning crosses alongside the road. But one of the things I'm proud of is I think the answer is more direct contact between church people with people suffering. And our young people who have gone on these work camps have had an exposure which I wished I had had earlier. And I think it's a great contribution to trying to get some resolution to the problem.
Let me just say one thing about that. In giving the talks on this subject in various churches, I have found again and again how people, it sparks reminiscences of just the kind you have you have given us. It's so interesting to hear the stories that people have to tell about these sorts of events.
If we have time for a question, I have one kind of left over from last week. Like Bill, I came of age, well, no, not came of age, but I grew up as a child in the 50s in the North, in Chicago, and I was not Presbyterian, I was Lutheran. I don't ever remember seeing a Black person in my church. I don't ever remember in the 50s any sermon on segregation, integration, despite the fact we all knew what was going on in Little Rock and some of the early segregation fights. But yet there was a great emphasis on serving the poor. In Chicago, that meant African Americans. And there was a tremendous effort on missionary work. I remember having missionaries come and stay in our house for a while. There seems to me to be a conflict there. How could they be so oblivious to the divide in our country, not doing anything about it in the 50s, and yet still be so anxious in bringing the Lord to Africa, India? I mean, do you see a conflict there? That's what seemed to be me last week when you were talking about their general lack of action.
Well, it's a wonderful question. And I think the answer is yes, there is a deep tension, maybe even contradiction. And it's not just in Lutheran, although I think it has been historically more pronounced in Lutheran churches than in Presbyterians. Presbyterians have been much more comfortable with the idea of changing the world through public action, through public policy, through bringing pressure to bear on public officials and being public officials themselves. But the fundamental contradiction to which you point is absolutely the case, and it has been true of all of mainline Protestantism and beyond. And that is sending missionaries to places where obviously the target is people of color, while at the same time distancing oneself from people of color at home.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And by the way, the last point on that is one of the most interesting developments eventually, takes a century or so, is that the missionaries themselves are some of the leading people in putting pressure on bringing this problem to light and putting pressure on the people back at home saying, well, look, if you're going to send me to Africa to preach the gospel to them, why doesn't that have some bearing on our situation here? So there was that connection, but it took a long time for it to develop. But that, by the way, the thing about a good question is, it tempts me to give a lecture, which I will not do. But that could well be the subject of another lecture.
Well, I hate to cut this off because it seems like everybody's anxious to have some good dialogue around this. And so I would welcome those of you who have ideas for future, either workshops, lectures, an additional conversation on this topic, because I really believe we need to really confront our history, which we've spent 3 weeks doing, in order to kind of confront our future and where we go from here. I'm an action-oriented person, so I'm always kind of looking forward, and trying to figure out where we go from here. But there's just so much more to uncover and discuss. So
maybe we could continue the discussion
during.
Stephanie, maybe we could continue the discussion during the fellowship hour this morning.
I won't personally be able to be there, but I'd be happy for all of you to join.
I think this requires more than a fellowship hour.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage. I think it's great. If there's a desire to talk, please do it.
Right.
And do it. You might say, while the iron is hot. It's absolutely true that this is something that needs to be talked through, worked through by congregations. I want to endorse
a big step forward, because as Diane pointed out, it wasn't something, and Bruce, you pointed out in your presentations, it's not something we were always comfortable talking about. And so thank you for helping us and facilitating that in the most constructive way. And I really appreciate it. I thank you. And I do want to point out that next week we have a speaker from YAV, Young Adult Volunteers. Her name is Reverend Blair Moorhead, and she'll be speaking on the Presbyterian Church's work with that organization. And it may tie in nicely with this, because I know they serve people they serve the poor. And then the week after that, we have Dr. Carla Works from the Wesley Theological Seminary. She's speaking on lessons from First Church Corinth. She was highly recommended to us. So I encourage you to join us for that. And on that same day at 5 p.m., we have Cynthia Erickson, who has a PhD. She's the head of the psychology department at the Fuller Theological Seminary. She'll be talking about practicing resilience. So we all need a little bit of that in this pandemic world we're living in today. Thanks, everybody. I'll let you log off and join the worship service. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.